Sometimes, the people who change your life don't arrive with a warning. They arrive with a knock on the door. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Chicago like a living thing, rattling loose signs and sending flurries of snow swirling beneath the glow of the streetlights. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and every weather channel in the city was warning residents to stay indoors. Emily Carter pulled her coat tighter as she climbed the worn steps to her apartment building, her boots crunching through a thin layer of ice. It was nearly 11:45 at night. Her shift at the grocery store had ended 2 hours earlier, but a delayed bus and a broken heater at work had stretched an already exhausting day into something that felt endless. Her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her shoulders ached from unloading inventory for most of the afternoon. All she wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before doing it all again tomorrow. She fumbled for her keys and pushed open the door to the small apartment she shared with her 6-year-old daughter, Sophie. Warm air greeted her immediately, carrying the faint scent of tomato soup from dinner. The apartment wasn't much. 2 tiny bedrooms, old carpet, secondhand furniture collected over years of careful budgeting. But it was home, and after everything she had survived, home mattered more than appearances. Emily locked the door behind her and peeked into Sophie's room. The little girl was asleep beneath a mountain of blankets, one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that had lost one of its ears years ago. Emily smiled despite her exhaustion. Sophie always managed to remind her why every sacrifice was worth it. She quietly closed the bedroom door and sat at the kitchen table. A stack of envelopes waited beside the salt shaker. Bills, rent, utilities, medical payments from Sophie's bout with pneumonia the previous winter. Emily rubbed her temples and opened her banking app. The number staring back at her was painfully familiar. $83.41. Payday was still 4 days away. She exhaled slowly and tried not to think about it. Worrying never changed the number. Outside, another gust of wind slammed against the building. The windows rattled. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm chirped briefly before falling silent. Emily stood and reached for the kettle. Maybe tea would help settle her nerves. The water had barely started heating when a sudden sound froze her in place. Knock, knock, knock. She turned toward the front door. Her heart skipped. Nobody visited this late, especially not during a winter storm. The knocking came again, louder this time, more desperate. Emily hesitated. Every safety warning she had ever heard rushed through her mind at once. She moved cautiously toward the door and glanced through the peephole. At first she saw nothing but darkness and blowing snow. Then a figure shifted into view. A woman, elderly, standing unsteadily beneath the porch light. Emily frowned. The woman's coat was covered in snow. Her gray hair clung damply to her face. Even from inside, Emily could tell she was shivering. Another knock came, weaker than before. Emily unlocked the deadbolt, but kept the chain latched. She opened the door a few inches. The icy wind immediately pushed into the apartment. "Ma'am," Emily called. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up slowly. Her face was pale from the cold. Her lips trembled. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then she whispered something so quietly Emily almost missed it. "Please," the woman's voice cracked. "Please don't leave me out here." Emily's stomach tightened. The woman swayed slightly, struggling to remain upright. In the glow of the porch light, Emily noticed something unexpected. Clutched tightly in the woman's gloved hand was an old silver pocket watch. It looked expensive, out of place, not something she would expect a stranded stranger to carry. But before Emily could think about it further, the woman's knees buckled. Emily reacted instantly. She unlatched the chain and pulled the door open. "Careful," she said, rushing forward. The woman stumbled but managed to stay standing as Emily grabbed her arm. Up close, the cold radiating from her coat was startling. "Come inside," Emily said. "You can't stay out here tonight." Tears filled the woman's tired eyes. She looked as though she wanted to say something more. Instead, she simply nodded. And as Emily guided the stranger across the threshold into the warmth of her tiny apartment, neither of them realized that by sunrise, everything was about to change. The moment the apartment door closed behind them, the howling wind disappeared, replaced by a silence so sudden it almost felt unreal. The elderly woman stood near the entrance, trembling as melted snow dripped from the hem of her coat onto the worn linoleum floor. Emily quickly locked the door and guided her toward the kitchen. Please sit down, she said gently. You need to warm up. The woman lowered herself carefully into one of the chairs at the small table. Her hands remained wrapped around the silver pocket watch as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Emily noticed how elegant her movements were despite her exhaustion. There was something unusual about her. Even beneath the layers of snow and fatigue, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that did not match someone wandering alone during a winter storm. Emily pushed the thought aside and hurried to the stove. Within minutes, she placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea in front of her guest. The woman looked at it for several seconds before finally lifting her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice was weak but refined. You did not have to do this. Emily offered a tired smile. My mother always said nobody should be outside on a night like this. The woman stared at her for a moment. Something softened in her expression. Then she wrapped both hands around the mug and closed her eyes as the warmth reached her fingers. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The apartment remained quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Emily opened a cabinet and pulled out the last can of chicken noodle soup she had been saving for the weekend. Money was tight, but she could not bring herself to let the woman go hungry. Soon the smell of soup filled the small kitchen. When Emily set the bowl in front of her, the woman looked genuinely surprised. You are feeding me too, she asked softly. Emily shrugged. You look like you have not eaten in a while. A faint smile touched the woman's lips. You have a kind heart. Emily almost laughed at that. Most days she felt like she was simply trying to survive. Kindness seemed like a luxury people with easier lives could afford. Yet as she watched the woman carefully lift the spoon, she realized her mother had been right about something. Sometimes helping another person cost less than regret. The woman finished nearly every drop of soup. Color slowly returned to her face. Emily felt relieved. Do you have family I can call? She asked. The question changed everything. The woman's hand froze. Her eyes drifted toward the pocket watch. For the first time, genuine sadness appeared in her expression. No, she said after a long pause. Not tonight. Emily sensed there was more to the story but did not press further. Everyone carried wounds they were not ready to share. Just then, a small voice drifted down the hallway. Mom. Sophie appeared at the edge of the kitchen wearing pink pajamas and rubbing sleep from her eyes. Who was that? Emily stood immediately. You should be in bed. Sophie ignored the instruction and stared curiously at the visitor. The woman looked equally surprised. Then something remarkable happened. The tired lines on her face softened completely. Well, she said quietly, you must be Sophie. The little girl nodded. How do you know my name? Emily smiled. Because I talk about you all the time. Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer. She walked closer and climbed onto Emily's lap. The woman watched them together with an expression Emily could not quite understand. It looked almost like longing. Or perhaps grief. She has your eyes, the woman said softly. Emily glanced at her daughter and smiled. People say that. For several moments, the woman simply watched them. Then her gaze drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the counter. It showed Emily and Sophie at Navy Pier the previous summer, both laughing as wind tangled their hair. The woman stared at the picture longer than expected. Beautiful, she murmured. What is? Sophie asked. This, the woman replied. A mother and daughter who clearly love each other very much. Sophie smiled proudly and wrapped both arms around Emily's neck. The woman blinked rapidly and looked away. Emily noticed moisture gathering in her eyes. Before she could ask if everything was all right, the woman quietly whispered something under her breath. It was so faint Emily almost missed it. Ethan, I am sorry. The name hung in the air for only a second before silence returned. Emily frowned slightly. The woman seemed unaware she had spoken aloud. Her gaze remained fixed on the photograph as though she had traveled somewhere far away. Outside, snow continued to fall against the windows. But inside the tiny apartment, another mystery had just begun. Emily lay awake long after Sophie had fallen back asleep. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional groan of old pipes and the steady ticking of the kitchen clock. Across the hall, the elderly woman occupied Sophie's room while Sophie slept beside Emily for the night. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it felt like the right thing to do. Still, something about the stranger lingered in Emily's thoughts. The way she spoke, the sadness in her eyes, the expensive silver pocket watch she refused to let go, and most of all, the name she had whispered. Ethan. Emily turned onto her side and stared at the faint glow of street lights filtering through the curtains. She told herself it was none of her business. People had histories. People carried regrets. Whatever burden the woman carried belonged to her. Eventually, exhaustion won. Emily drifted asleep sometime after 1 in the morning. Hours later, a sound pulled her back to consciousness. At first, she thought it was part of a dream. Then she heard it again. A voice. Soft. Unsteady. Coming from down the hallway. Emily sat upright immediately. The digital clock beside her bed read 3:17 a.m. She carefully slipped out from beneath the blankets and moved toward the hall. The apartment was dark except for a sliver of moonlight spilling through the living room window. As she approached Sophie's room, the voice became clearer. The woman was talking in her sleep. Emily stopped outside the partially open door. "I should have stayed," the woman murmured. "I should have told him." Her words sounded broken. Fragments of a conversation trapped somewhere between memory and regret. Emily remained still. "Ethan," the woman whispered again. "I never stopped loving you." A long silence followed. Then another sentence. So faint Emily barely heard it. "Please forgive me." The words settled heavily in the darkness. Emily suddenly felt like an accidental witness to something deeply personal. She quietly stepped away from the doorway and returned to her room. But sleep no longer came easily. The woman's voice echoed in her mind. Whatever had happened, it clearly involved someone she cared about deeply. By morning, the storm had begun to weaken. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the windows as Emily prepared breakfast. Pancakes were a luxury she could not afford often, but Sophie had been asking for them all week. Today seemed like a good day to say yes. The smell of batter and coffee soon filled the apartment. Sophie sat at the table coloring while Emily flipped pancakes on the griddle. The little girl looked up suddenly. "Do you think she likes pancakes?" Emily smiled. "I guess we will find out." A few minutes later, the woman appeared in the hallway. She looked different. Rested. Her hair was neatly brushed back. The color had returned to her cheeks. For the first time, Emily could see traces of the woman she might have been years earlier. Graceful. Confident. Distinguished. The woman paused when she saw the breakfast table. Something in her expression softened. "Good morning," Emily said. "I hope you slept okay." "Better than I have in a very long time," the woman replied. Sophie immediately waved. "We saved you pancakes." The woman smiled warmly. "That is very kind of you." During breakfast, conversation came more naturally. Sophie talked about school, her favorite teacher, her dream of owning a dog someday. The woman listened attentively, laughing softly at the right moments. Emily noticed how comfortable Sophie seemed around her. Children often sense things adults missed. If Sophie trusted her, that counted for something. At one point, the woman glanced around the apartment. Her eyes lingered on the aging furniture, the patched curtains, and the stack of overdue bills Emily had forgotten to hide. "You work very hard," she said quietly. Emily gave a small shrug. Most parents do. Not all of them. Something about the way she said it carried unexpected weight. Emily looked up, but found the woman staring into her coffee cup. A few minutes later, Sophie excused herself to get dressed. The apartment grew quieter. The woman reached into the pocket of her coat and carefully removed the silver pocket watch. For several seconds she studied it. Then she placed it gently on the table. Sunlight caught the polished metal, revealing intricate engravings Emily had not noticed before. It was beautiful, far more valuable than anything else inside the apartment. "That watch must mean a lot to you," Emily said. The woman's fingers rested lightly against the cover. "It is one of the few things I have left." Emily hesitated. "And Ethan?" The woman froze. The question hung between them. For a moment, Emily worried she had crossed a line. Then the woman slowly lifted her eyes. Pain flickered across her face. Deep, old, unhealed. She opened her mouth as though preparing to answer. But before a single word could leave her lips, her gaze shifted toward the window. Her expression changed instantly. Shock, disbelief, fear. Emily turned to follow her stare. Outside, several blocks away, black vehicles were moving slowly through the neighborhood streets. The black vehicles continued moving slowly along the snow-covered street before disappearing behind a row of apartment buildings. For a moment, nobody spoke. The woman remained frozen beside the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the window. The color had drained from her face again. Emily glanced between her and the street. "Do you know them?" she asked carefully. The woman did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the silver pocket watch. I should go, she said quietly. Emily blinked. What? I cannot stay here. The sudden change in her voice startled Emily. Just minutes earlier, she had seemed relaxed, almost peaceful. Now she looked anxious, restless, like someone who had seen a ghost. You do not have to leave, Emily said. The storm is still clearing. The woman forced a small smile. You have already done more than enough. Sophie returned from her room, wearing her winter coat and backpack. Are you leaving? She asked. The disappointment in her voice was impossible to miss. The woman looked at her, and something seemed to break inside her expression. I am afraid so. Sophie frowned. But you just got here. The woman knelt slowly despite her age and placed a gentle hand on the little girl's shoulder. Sometimes people only stay for a short time, she said softly. That does not mean they forget the kindness they were shown. Sophie considered that answer seriously before wrapping her arms around the woman in a sudden hug. Emily expected the stranger to be surprised. Instead, tears immediately filled her eyes. She hugged Sophie back as though holding on to something precious, something she had not felt in years. Emily looked away, suddenly feeling like she was witnessing a deeply personal moment. A few minutes later, the woman stood near the front door with her coat buttoned. Snow still drifted through the cold morning air outside. Emily could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. At least let me call someone for you, she said. A friend, family, anybody. The woman hesitated. For one brief moment, Emily thought she might finally explain everything. Instead, she reached into her pocket and removed the silver watch. Keep this for me, she said unexpectedly. Emily stared at her. I cannot do that. Please. The woman gently placed the watch into Emily's hand. I will come back for it. The metal felt surprisingly heavy. This looks valuable. Its value is not measured in dollars. The woman's voice softened. Just keep it safe. Emily wanted to protest, but something in the woman's expression stopped her. There was trust there, and gratitude, and perhaps a silent request she could not fully understand. Before Emily could say another word, the woman opened the door. A blast of cold air swept inside. Then she stepped into the winter morning and disappeared down the sidewalk. Emily stood at the doorway for several seconds, watching her walk away. The figure moved slowly but with determination, growing smaller against the white landscape until she finally vanished around the corner. By the time Emily took Sophie to school and caught the bus to work, the strange encounter already felt almost dreamlike. Customers came and went throughout the day. Grocery carts rattled across tile floors. Cash registers beeped endlessly. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet every time Emily glanced at the pocket watch resting inside her purse, she found herself wondering where the woman was and whether she was safe. During her lunch break, curiosity finally got the better of her. Sitting alone in the employee break room, Emily carefully opened the watch. The cover clicked softly. Inside was an old photograph. Her breath caught immediately. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, smiled brightly at the camera. On the opposite side of the photograph, elegant handwriting had faded with time but remained readable. Ethan. Never stop looking forward. Emily stared at the image. The same name again. Ethan. The name the woman had whispered in her sleep. The name that seemed connected to so much pain. She gently closed the watch. Questions filled her mind, but there were no answers. The rest of her shift passed slowly. By the time she arrived home that evening, darkness had already settled over the city. Sophie sat at the kitchen table working on homework while Emily reheated leftovers. For the first time in years, the apartment felt strangely empty. The woman had only been there one night, yet her absence seemed noticeable. Around 7 o'clock, a loud engine noise echoed outside. Emily barely paid attention at first. Their neighborhood saw delivery trucks all the time. Then another engine arrived. And another. Sophie looked toward the window. Mom, she said slowly. There are a lot of cars outside. Emily walked over and pulled back the curtain. Her heart skipped. Parked along both sides of the street were several black luxury SUVs. Men in dark coats stepped onto the sidewalks. Neighbors peeked through windows. Apartment doors opened. The entire block seemed to be watching. Then one final vehicle pulled to a stop directly in front of Emily's building. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped out. Even from half a block away, there was something commanding about him. He scanned the buildings once before his gaze settled on hers. And then, to Emily's complete shock, he started walking straight toward her front door. Emily stood motionless beside the window as the man crossed the street. The glow from the streetlights reflected off the fresh snow, illuminating his path. He moved with calm confidence, the kind that came from years of being listened to the moment he entered a room. His dark wool coat fit perfectly. His posture was straight. Even from a distance, he looked completely out of place in a neighborhood where most families worried more about rent than appearances. Sophie pressed her face against the glass. Is he coming here? Emily swallowed. I think so. A few seconds later, a knock echoed through the apartment. Firm, polite, deliberate. Every conversation in the building seemed to stop at once. Emily could almost feel her neighbors listening through their walls. She glanced at Sophie, then at the purse resting on the kitchen counter. The silver pocket watch was still inside. Somehow she already knew why the man had come. Taking a steadying breath, she opened the door. Up close, the stranger appeared to be around 40 years old. His sharp features carried traces of exhaustion beneath their composure. Snowflakes rested on his dark hair. His blue eyes immediately searched her face, as though hoping to find an answer before speaking a single word. Ms. Emily Carter? He asked. His voice was deep and controlled. Yes. Relief flashed across his expression. Not complete relief, just enough to suggest he had been searching for something important. My name is Ethan Whitmore. The name hit Emily instantly. Ethan, the same name inside the watch. The same name whispered during the night. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then his gaze shifted past her shoulder toward the apartment. May I ask you a question? Emily nodded cautiously. Have you seen an elderly woman in the last 24 hours? There it was. The question she had expected. She stayed here. Last night, Emily admitted. Ethan closed his eyes. The reaction lasted less than a second, but it carried years of emotion. When he opened them again, the controlled businessman was gone for just a moment. In his place stood a worried grandson. She was here, he asked quietly. Emily stepped aside. Would you like to come in? Ethan entered the apartment while two men from the sidewalk remained outside. Sophie stared openly from the kitchen table. Ethan offered her a small smile before returning his attention to Emily. When did she leave? Emily explained everything. The storm, the knock on the door, the soup, the night, the breakfast, her sudden departure that morning. Ethan listened without interrupting. Every detail seemed to matter. When Emily finally finished, silence filled the room. Then Ethan looked down at the table. Did she leave anything behind? Emily hesitated before retrieving the watch from her purse. The moment Ethan saw it, his composure cracked completely. His eyes widened. He reached for it slowly, almost reverently. I cannot believe she gave this to you. Emily watched his reaction carefully. What is it? Ethan ran his thumb across the engraved cover. This belonged to my grandfather. His voice softened. After he passed away, my grandmother carried it every day for nearly 30 years. Emily felt her chest tighten. Your grandmother? Ethan nodded. Grace Whitmore. The room suddenly felt smaller. The pieces began falling into place. The woman who stayed here is your grandmother? She is. Ethan lowered his gaze. Or at least I hope she still is. Something in those words made Emily pause. What do you mean? Ethan exhaled slowly. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had been carrying the same burden for years. 3 days ago, she disappeared from a private medical facility. Emily stared at him. Disappeared? She left without telling anyone. He glanced toward the watch again. My grandmother has spent most of her life protecting other people from her pain. Unfortunately, she has always been very good at it. Emily remembered the sadness in Grace's eyes, the regret, the names spoken in the darkness. Suddenly it all felt heavier. Why were you searching this neighborhood? Ethan asked. Emily frowned. What do you mean? She has access to properties all over the country. Luxury homes, private accommodations, staff, resources. His gaze slowly moved around the modest apartment. Yet somehow she chose to spend the night here. Emily looked down, embarrassed by the worn furniture and peeling paint. Ethan seemed to notice. That was not criticism, he said gently. Actually, it makes me curious. He paused before continuing. My grandmother has met thousands of people in her life. Politicians, executives, celebrities. Yet the last place she chose to stay was a 2-bedroom apartment belonging to a single mother she had never met before. His voice softened further. That tells me more about you than any background check ever could. Emily blinked. Background check. Ethan almost smiled. You would be surprised how many people we spoke to today. Before Emily could respond, one of the men outside stepped through the doorway carrying a tablet. He approached Ethan and spoke quietly. Ethan listened for several seconds. Then his expression changed. Hope appeared for the first time since he arrived. He looked up at Emily. They found her. For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air between relief and disbelief. Ethan stared at the man holding the tablet as though afraid the information might disappear if he blinked. Where? He asked quietly. Lincoln Park, the man replied. A volunteer at a church outreach center recognized her from the photographs. Ethan closed his eyes and released a breath he appeared to have been holding for days. When he opened them again, gratitude replaced the tension in his expression. Thank you. The man nodded and stepped back outside. The apartment fell silent. Sophie looked up from her chair. Your grandma is okay? Ethan smiled for the first time since arriving. It transformed his entire face. Yes, I think she is. Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer. She returned to her coloring book while Ethan stood near the kitchen table, staring at the pocket watch in his hands. Emily noticed that he had not rushed toward the door despite finally finding the person he had been searching for. Instead, he seemed lost in thought. You really care about her, Emily said softly. Ethan glanced up. She raised me. He lowered his gaze again. After my parents died, she became everything. Emily felt her heart tighten. She had not expected that. Ethan Whitmore was one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. Even she knew the name. His company owned hotels, technology firms, and commercial properties across the country. Yet in that moment, he did not look like a billionaire. He looked like a grandson who had been terrified of losing someone he loved. She spoke about you, Emily said. Ethan looked up immediately. She did. Not directly. Emily hesitated. But she said your name several times during the night. Something flickered across his face. Hope. Sadness. Regret. What did she say? Emily remembered the whispers drifting through the darkness. The apology. The sorrow. The unfinished sentences. Mostly that she was sorry. Ethan became very still. Snow drifted past the window behind him while silence settled over the room. That sounds like her, he said finally. Emily waited. After a long pause, Ethan continued speaking. 20 years ago, my father died unexpectedly. His voice remained calm, but the pain underneath it was impossible to miss. My grandmother never recovered. She blamed herself for things she could not control. He looked toward the watch again. Eventually, she stopped talking about the past altogether. Emily listened quietly. And then, Ethan gave a faint smile without humor. And then she spent 2 decades pretending she was fine while everyone around her pretended to believe her. The honesty in his answer surprised her. Wealthy people were often portrayed as having perfect lives. Yet standing in her kitchen was a man carrying grief that no amount of money could erase. Sophie suddenly looked up. My mom says pretending usually makes things worse. Ethan laughed softly. A genuine laugh this time. Your mom sounds very wise. Sophie grinned proudly. Emily rolled her eyes, making both of them smile. For a brief moment, the atmosphere lightened. Then Ethan reached inside his coat and removed a small envelope. He placed it gently on the table. Emily frowned. What is that? A thank you. She did not touch it. You do not need to do that. Actually, I do. No, Emily folded her arms. I helped her because she needed help. Ethan studied her carefully. Do you know how many people turned her away? Emily blinked. What? We traced her movements. His expression grew serious. Several places. Several opportunities for someone to stop and help. He paused. You were the only person who opened the door. Emily looked down. She did not know what to say, because the truth was simple. If she had been the one standing outside in the cold, she would have prayed for someone to do the same. Ethan slowly pushed the envelope back into his coat. That answer explains a lot. Emily glanced up. What does that mean? Ethan smiled slightly. It means my grandmother was right about you. Before Emily could ask what he meant, his phone vibrated. He checked the screen. The moment he read the message, emotion flooded his eyes. She is asking for you, he said quietly. Emily frowned. Me? Ethan nodded. The first thing she said after they found her was that she wanted to know whether the young mother and little girl were okay. His smile deepened. And then she asked if Emily Carter had eaten dinner yet. Emily stared at Ethan for several seconds, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Of all the things she expected to hear that evening, that was not one of them. The image of Grace sitting at her kitchen table returned immediately. The careful way she had listened to Sophie. The gratitude in her eyes over a simple bowl of soup. The sadness she carried behind every smile. She asked if we had eaten dinner? Emily repeated. Ethan nodded. Apparently that was one of her first questions. A warmth spread through Emily's chest. It was such a small detail, yet somehow it revealed more about Grace than any explanation ever could. Even after being found. Even after 3 days missing. Even after worrying her entire family. She was still thinking about someone else. Sophie looked up from her coloring book. Can we see her? Ethan glanced toward Emily before answering. I think she would like that very much. The invitation lingered in the room. Emily immediately thought about work tomorrow. Bills. Responsibilities. The ordinary concerns that governed every day of her life. Yet another thought pushed through them. Grace had arrived at her door as a stranger. Somehow, in less than 24 hours, she no longer felt like one. An hour later, Emily and Sophie found themselves riding in the back seat of one of the black SUVs. Sophie sat beside the window, fascinated by the city lights passing through the snowy evening. Ethan sat across from them. The vehicle was spacious and quiet, yet there was nothing flashy about him. No arrogance. No attempt to impress anyone. In fact, the longer Emily spent around him, the less he resembled the image she had formed of powerful executives. Can I ask you something? She said. Ethan nodded. Of course. Why did Grace leave? For a moment, Ethan looked out the window. Chicago's skyline shimmered against the winter sky. I think she became tired. Tired. Not physically. He smiled sadly. Tired of being protected. Emily listened carefully. My grandmother spent years surrounded by staff, assistants, security teams, doctors. Everyone wanted to keep her safe. His gaze lowered. But somewhere along the way, people stopped treating her like a person. The answer surprised Emily. Including you? Ethan did not seem offended by the question. If anything, he appreciated the honesty. Especially me. Silence settled between them. I convinced myself I was helping her, he continued. Making things easier. Solving problems before she had to face them. He shook his head. What I did not realize was that she missed ordinary life. Emily thought about the previous night. The way Grace had smiled while helping Sophie set the table. The way she had watched snow fall through the apartment window. The way she had treasured simple conversation. Suddenly it made sense. She looked happy in my apartment, Emily said quietly. Ethan smiled. That does not surprise me. The SUV eventually turned through iron gates and entered a private medical campus surrounded by snow-covered trees. Soft lights illuminated the walkways. The atmosphere felt peaceful rather than clinical. Moments later, they stepped inside a warm reception area. A nurse greeted Ethan immediately. She is waiting. Those 3 words seemed to affect him more than anything else that evening. As they followed the nurse down a quiet hallway, Emily noticed Ethan's pace slowing. For the first time, he looked nervous. Not like a billionaire. Not like a CEO. Just like a grandson about to see someone he loved. The nurse stopped outside a private room and opened the door. Grace sat beside a window overlooking the snowy gardens. She wore a light blue sweater and held a cup of tea between her hands. The moment she looked up, her eyes found Sophie first. Her entire face brightened. There is my little friend, she said softly. Sophie ran forward without hesitation. Grace opened her arms and hugged her tightly. Tears immediately appeared in her eyes. Then her gaze shifted toward Emily. Gratitude filled her expression. Real. Unfiltered. You came, Grace whispered. Emily smiled gently. Of course we did. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Words suddenly felt unnecessary. Finally, Grace looked toward Ethan. The room grew quiet. 20 years of history seemed to pass between them in a single glance. Ethan took one slow step forward. Then another. Grandma, he said softly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Hello, Ethan. For several seconds, neither Grace nor Ethan moved. The silence between them carried years of unspoken words, old regrets, and missed opportunities. Then Grace slowly set her tea on the table and reached for his hand. You have more gray hair than I remember, she said softly. Ethan laughed through the emotion in his voice. You disappeared for 3 days, and that is the first thing you notice? A faint smile appeared on Grace's face. I noticed much more than that. Ethan pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. The tension that had followed him all evening seemed to ease for the first time. Sophie remained near the window, quietly watching snow drift across the gardens. Emily stood a respectful distance away, uncertain whether she should stay or leave. Grace solved the problem herself. "Emily," she said gently, "please sit down." Emily took a nearby chair. Grace looked at her for several moments. "There is something I should tell all of you." The room grew quiet. Even Ethan seemed surprised by the seriousness in her tone. Grace folded her hands together. "I did not leave because I was confused." Ethan frowned. "Grandma, let me finish." Her voice remained calm but firm. "Everyone assumed I wandered away." She looked directly at him. "But I chose to leave." Ethan lowered his eyes. He already knew the answer before she spoke it. "Why?" Grace glanced toward the snowy gardens outside. "Because I wanted one ordinary day." Nobody interrupted. "For years people have watched me, protected me, scheduled every hour of my life." She smiled sadly. "I know they meant well." Her gaze returned to Ethan. "You meant well too." Ethan looked away. Grace continued. "But somewhere along the way, everyone became so focused on keeping me safe that they forgot to ask whether I was happy." The words settled heavily over the room. Emily remembered the previous night. The simple joy Grace had found in helping set the table. The way she laughed at Sophie's stories. The peaceful expression she wore while sipping tea in a tiny apartment. Grace looked toward Emily. "Do you know what I loved most about your home?" Emily shook her head. "Nobody treated me like a project." Tears appeared in Grace's eyes. "You treated me like a person." Ethan stared at the floor. The truth clearly hurt. Yet he never tried to argue with it. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I was afraid of losing you." Grace's expression softened immediately. "I know. After Dad died, you were all I had left." His voice grew quieter. "Every decision I made came from that fear." Grace squeezed his hand. "And every decision I made came from mine." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" Grace smiled sadly. "I spent 20 years believing I failed my son." The confession seemed to drain something from her. "I thought if I had done one thing differently, he might still be here." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Grace gently shook her head. "Grief convinced me that. Guilt was the same thing as love." The room fell silent. Even Sophie stopped coloring. Grace turned toward Ethan. "The truth is, I spent so much time mourning what I lost that I forgot to appreciate what remained." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And what remained was you." Ethan's composure finally broke. He leaned forward and embraced her carefully. Grace wrapped her arms around him. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply held on. Emily felt her own eyes sting. There was something powerful about watching two people finally stop carrying pain alone. When they eventually pulled apart, Grace smiled through her tears. "Then I met a little girl who offered me half her pancake without being asked." Sophie brightened immediately. "Because sharing is nice." Grace laughed softly. "Yes, it is." She looked toward Emily. "And I met a young mother who opened her door to a stranger during the coldest night of the year." Emily felt embarrassed by the attention. Anyone would have done the same. Ethan and Grace exchanged a glance. Then both smiled. "No," Grace said gently. "Not everyone would have." 6 months later, spring sunlight poured through the large windows of a community center on Chicago's South Side. Children laughed in the courtyard outside, while volunteers prepared boxes of groceries for local families. A new sign hung above the entrance. Grace Whitmore Family Outreach Center. Emily stood near the front desk reviewing schedules with a small team of staff members. Sometimes she still found it difficult to believe how much had changed. Not because someone had rescued her, and not because a billionaire had solved all her problems. The change had happened slowly, one opportunity at a time. After months of conversations, Grace had convinced her to help design community programs for single parents. What began as a part-time consulting role eventually became a full-time position. Emily had discovered something she never expected. She was good at helping people, really good at it. Every struggle she had faced had given her an understanding that could not be taught in classrooms or boardrooms. Sophie, now 7 years old, raced through the lobby carrying a stack of drawings. "Mom," she called. "Grandma Grace wants to see these." Emily smiled automatically. The title still sounded unusual, yet nobody questioned it anymore. Grace had become part of their lives in a way none of them could have predicted. The older woman now divided her time between her own home and community projects across the city. She looked healthier, happier, more alive than she had in years. Most importantly, she no longer spent her days surrounded only by people trying to protect her. She spent them surrounded by people she genuinely cared about. Across the room, Grace sat beside a group of children reading a storybook. Her laughter drifted through the building. Ethan stood nearby speaking with several donors. The moment he noticed Sophie running toward Grace, his expression softened. Emily had seen that look many times over the past months. It appeared whenever he watched the people he loved together. Their relationship had changed too. Not overnight. Not through grand speeches. Through honesty. Through difficult conversations. Through forgiveness. Grace no longer carried her grief alone. Ethan no longer carried his fear alone. Neither of them was perfect, but both were healing. Ethan eventually crossed the room and stopped beside Emily. "Busy day?" he asked. "Always." He smiled. "Grace has already signed up 3 new volunteers." Emily laughed. "That sounds about right." Together, they watched Grace show Sophie how to read dramatically by changing her voice for every character. The little girl laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her chair. Ethan shook his head affectionately. "You know," he said quietly, "she still talks about that night." Emily looked at him. "The storm?" He nodded. "She says it changed her life." Emily glanced toward Grace. "I think she gives me too much credit." "No," Ethan's voice was gentle. "I think she finally saw something she had been searching for." Emily frowned slightly. "What was that?" Ethan smiled. "Proof." "Proof of what?" He looked toward the crowded community center, toward the families receiving help, toward Sophie laughing beside Grace, toward a room filled with ordinary people choosing kindness every day. "That goodness still exists," he said. Across the room, Grace looked up and caught Emily's eye. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. They simply smiled. No words were necessary, because both of them remembered a freezing winter night. A small apartment, a bowl of soup, a simple act of compassion offered without expectation. The world often celebrates wealth, power, and success. But sometimes the most important thing a person can give is a door left open when someone else has nowhere to go. Grace had arrived as a stranger. She left as family, and Emily learned something she would carry for the rest of her life. Kindness does not always change the world in a single moment. Sometimes it changes one life, then another, until one day you realize it changed your own.